thank you so much, Christine and Abe, for sponsoring this series. It has been so much fun sharing the films with you for the last 3 weeks. And I'm also so happy to have such a good, as Christine mentioned, such a good turnout before Christmas. Well, I don't think that any reason is needed to show a great romantic comedy, but I do have at least 5 good reasons that today's movie is part of our series on Hollywood Gamechangers. And those 5 reasons are: Best Original Screenplay, Robert Riskin. Best Director, Frank Capra. Best Actor, Clark Gable. Best Actress, Claudette Colbert. And Best Picture of 1934, It Happened One Night. This is the first movie ever to win all of the major Academy Awards, and that feat was not matched for another 41 years. Not bad for a movie that neither of its 2 stars wanted to be in, especially since it was being made at what was then considered a Poverty Row studio. That studio being Columbia Pictures. You may have heard of it. It's still around today, some 9 decades later, and that's another reason that this movie was and is a game changer. Those Oscar wins for It Happened One Night, along with its success at the box office, changed the industry's perception of Columbia Pictures. This was a movie that the biggest studio in Hollywood, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, would have been very proud to have made. And Columbia studio head Harry Cohn recognized that with this film, he had found a winning formula to continue to build his studio's reputation. But before we go there, let's take just a few steps back to a time that was, for most people, anything except romantic or comic. I'm talking about America in the early 1930s, the time of the Great Depression. To escape those harsh realities, people scraped together 10 cents or 25 cents in a big city to go to the movies. Among the studios eager to collect those dimes and quarters was this fairly ramshackle operation, Columbia Pictures. It was founded in 1918 by New Yorker Harry Cohn, along with his brother Jack and a man named Joe Brandt. The studio's original name was CBC, but when people in the industry started saying that CBC stood for corned beef and cabbage, the studio decided that Columbia Pictures sounded better, so that was the name as of 1924. Now, it is often said that Harry Cohn was possibly the rudest and crudest of Hollywood studio moguls, and that is probably true. It is definitely true that Columbia movies of the 1920s were several notches below the elegant films being released by the likes of MGM or Paramount. But Harry Cohn was nothing if not ambitious. He knew that Depression-era audiences did not want to see depressing movies. They wanted stars, they wanted style, they wanted glamour. So in 1932, at the suggestion of his wife, Harry hired the respected fashion designer Robert Calick as a full-time costume designer for the studio. And it was Calick's dresses that were part of the reason that stars like Carole Lombard and Barbara Stanwyck started coming to Columbia in the early 1930s to make individual pictures there. And I have to admit this is a bit of a side plug because I just made a short documentary on Robert Calick for the upcoming release of the movie His Girl Friday in the 4K video format. So that was certainly a lot of fun to delve into that aspect of Columbia's history. Well, by 1932, Harry Cohn also had his eye on a 35-year-old Italian-born director who had been at Columbia since 1928. That director's name was Francesco Rosario Capra, but of course we know him as Frank Capra. Capra had started in movies making slapstick comedies for Max Sennett of Keystone Cops fame, but by the early 1930s, Frank Capra was making comedies and dramas at Columbia, and his work was getting more and more polished. This was a young man in a hurry to make it to the top of the Hollywood pecking order. But Capra's movies at Columbia tended to be rather hit or miss quality-wise. That is, until he came upon a story recently published in Cosmopolitan magazine. The story was called Night Bus, and that was the working title of the film for a while. And the story was about a spoiled but pretty heiress who runs away from a man that she doesn't love, grabs a bus and meets a young chemist that she does fall in love with. Well, Frank Capra recognized in that premise the idea for a good romantic comedy, and he pitched it to a 36-year-old screenwriter that he had just worked with on another film. That writer's name was Robert Riskin, and do remember that name and watch for it on movies of the 30s, because it is invariably a sign of quality. Some screenwriters were good at dialogue, some were good at constructing a story, some could come up with vivid characters. Well, Robert Riskin could do all of that, and best of all, he could write characters that moviegoers fell in love with. Riskin took the story, Night Bus, and he improved it considerably. Instead of having its heroine, the spoiled heiress, run away from a man that she doesn't love, Riskin thought it would be interesting to change it to a woman running away from her father to get to the man that she thinks she loves, only to realize that she does not love him after she meets, well, not a chemist, as in the original story. The male character was changed to a charming but cynical newspaper reporter, someone who initially sees the girl as a meal ticket since everyone in the country is looking for her. But of course, fate, like that Night Bus, has twists and turns in store. Capra and Harry Cohn loved Riskin's screenplay, which was partly written at the La Quinta Hotel, where Riskin and Frank Capra rented a cottage so they could focus on their work. And in fact, Capra would later call it, quote, our Shangri-La for script writing in the coming years. After reading the script, Harry Cohn wanted the actor Robert Montgomery for the leading man. Robert Montgomery, father of Elizabeth from Bewitched. Robert Montgomery was a big star at MGM at the time. And fortunately, MGM had made a deal with Columbia that allowed Harry Cohn to borrow one of MGM's male actors for a film at Columbia. But Louis B. Mayer didn't want to give them Robert Montgomery. He was too valuable. Instead, it is said that Mayer used his deal with Columbia to punish an actor that he had under contract. Mayer sent one of his relatively new stars, a guy named Clark Gable, to the salt mines of Columbia, because Gable had irked Mayer recently by pointing out that Gable, was being overworked. And he had a point. In 1931, Gable appeared in no fewer than 11 movies. They worked people then. Now, up to this time, Gable had usually played tough guys, either rough heroes or rough gangsters. He did not have a reputation for playing light romantic comedy. And when Gable read the script that was still called Night Bus, he didn't like it. But since he was under contract, he had no choice, so he showed up reluctantly to do his time at Columbia Pictures. When it came to Gable's co-star for the film, 6 leading ladies, including Myrna Loy and Loretta Young, turned the part down. And then Harry Cohn had an idea. He decided that he wanted to hire Claudette Colbert, who was a popular actress working mostly at Paramount in the early 1930s. There was just one problem. Claudette Colbert and Frank Capra had made a silent movie together back in 1927. It was called For the Love of Mike, and it was Claudette Colbert's first movie. Capra was racing through it to stay on budget, and by the time the film was done, according to a colleague, they ended up hating each other. So many auspicious signs for this film today. Well, not surprisingly, Claudette Colbert said no to Night Bus, and it was only when Harry Cohn, who was the kind of guy who would make sure all the lights were switched off before leaving the studio, it was only when Cohn promised to pay her $50,000 that she said yes, and that is over $1 million today. Capra had just $325,000 to make the entire feature. And he was given a tight schedule of 36 shoot days for a movie that was all about traveling to various places. According to Capra's nephew Joe, who was a sound man on the film, the attitude among the crew was, quote, hell, let's get this stinking picture over with. Well, much like the romance that you will see on screen, which starts in mutual dislike, something rather magical happened during the making of this movie. Gable and Colbert had fantastic chemistry. They had great scenes to play, and maybe because no one expected much, Frank Capra managed to create a relaxed, even fun atmosphere on the set. According to the cinematographer, the great Joseph Walker, Capra and Gable hit it off, quote, like a couple of overgrown prankish kids. And as the screenwriter Robert Riskin later said, it was a miracle. The result is a movie filled with charm. It helped launch the so-called screwball comedy genre. And as essayist Brian Eggert wrote, whenever life on the road provides a life-altering experience, whenever a bride changes her mind at the last minute, and whenever two bickering adults fall in love, It Happened One Night is among the influences. For me, this movie represents the best of the Hollywood studio system in the 1930s. All the different pieces, screenplay, acting, direction, costume, cinematography, all of it comes together. It also uses its time period of the Depression to enhance the love story, making you feel those tough times as another challenge that the characters are facing. When It Happened One Night opened on February 22nd, 1934, word of mouth turned this into a box office smash. The film that had cost a little over $300,000 to make made over $2.5 million worldwide at the height of the Depression. And that made it one of the most profitable of all Columbia films in relation to cost. Audiences loved Gable and Colbert as a screen couple, and two sequences in particular stood out for them, then and now for audiences. I will just say Hitchhiking and The Wall of Jericho, and you will know them when you see them. Well, especially after those 5 Academy Award wins, Harry Cohn recognized in Frank Capra a filmmaker of the first magnitude. And for the rest of the 1930s, they made exceptional movies together that included Mr. Deeds Goes to Town with Gary Cooper, Lost Horizon with Ronald Colman, You Can't Take It With You with James Stewart, another Best Picture winner, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the film that really made Jimmy Stewart a movie star. But Columbia didn't need Capra to score hits. Cary Grant came over to the studio occasionally to make great films like The Awful Truth and His Girl Friday. Fred Astaire made 2 hit films with Rita Hayworth at Columbia. And by the 1950s, Columbia was making epics like David Lean's Best Picture winner, The Bridge on the River Kwai. And why is Harry Cohn smiling? Well, if you look over in the corner of that photo, you'll see a lot of Oscars over there. So let's watch the movie that played an essential part in making all of that happen, with a script by Robert Riskin, costumes by Kalloch, and shimmering photography by Joseph Walker. Here is, from 1934, It Happened One Night. Thank you. Well, I look forward to your comments on the movie in our Q&A, however long or brief that is afterwards. But I was just going to say one thing. Of course, this movie is filled with scenes that audiences and film critics would remember and still delight people today. But one scene is said to have caused great consternation among one group of moviegoers in 1934. Remember when Clark Gable took off his shirt and revealed his bare chest? Well, the legend is that the revelation that Gable did not wear an undershirt caused a precipitous drop in undershirt sales. And there is no way to prove this, but it is one of the most enduring pieces of lore surrounding It Happened One Night. And one thing I did just for fun while watching the movie is Claudette Colbert famously thought that she should always be photographed on the left side of her face. She didn't think the right side photographed as well. So I thought just for fun I would watch this and try to see how many times we saw her the right side of her face in a medium shot or a close-up. There are at least 500 edits in this movie. I counted 7 times that you saw the right side of her face. And it looked beautiful, I thought. Well, if you have any questions about this movie or thoughts about future series, please, you can contact me through the website or here, of course, through the library. And I also just wanted to recommend an excellent book written by my friend Victoria Riskin, the daughter of the screenwriter Robert Riskin. It's called Fay Wray and Robert Riskin, A Hollywood Memoir, because yes, her mother was Fay Wray of King Kong fame. And it's a wonderful book, a great love story. But speaking of stories, I would like to hear from you now. And I would be wonderful, yes, house lights up. TJ is back, thank you, with the microphone. And if you would just raise your hands, Mr. Hicks will bring the microphone to you, because I would love to hear whether it's a question or your thoughts. Yes, right here.
I could have seen Cary Grant in that role.
Well, it's a good thing we didn't, only in that Cary Grant didn't become Cary Grant as we think of him until 1937. The Awful Truth is considered by many people the first time that the Cary Grant persona crystallized. And I don't disagree with you. Cary Grant was a wonderful leading man. Columbia loved him once he became successful. But I think that Gable had an earthier touch to him. Now, that's odd to say about Cary Grant, who was really Archie Leach from Bristol, England, and was a stilts walker before he was a movie actor. So you're right. I'm sure he could have done it wonderfully. Yes, Mr. Harris.
Did you find it unusual that there was no musical score for this movie?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jimmy. Yes, there was no musical score in the film, and that might have been, a cynic might say, thrift on the part of Columbia, but it didn't need a musical score. There was such a great rhythm to the dialogue, a rhythm to the scenes, and when there is music, when they all sing The Man in the Flying Trapeze, or when Alan Hale lets out his tenor, the music sort of is used, I think, very effectively. But yes, I think it's terrific. As someone who's written 2 books about film composers, I think that this movie shows that you do not always need to have a musical score. And I find it particularly, its absence, I should say, is so effective in the scene when they're first side by side and the walls of Jericho are up and you just hear the rain, and there was wonderful cross-cutting between them, and you just hear the rain and that beautiful backlighting from Joseph Walker bringing in the light through the window. It's just gorgeous. So yes, absolutely. Yes, sir, in the back.
Sir, in 1934, was the Hayes office in place in Hollywood? Because they would have certainly had an opinion about the, what do they call it, the motor camp, the motel scene.
Yes, the gentleman in the back was asking about whether basically the Hollywood production code, the censorship, was being enforced at the time of this film. Well, we can all be very grateful that Frank Capra made this movie quickly, because it was released at the end of February 1934. And on July 1st of 1934, Joseph Breen stepped in and enforced to the letter the Hollywood production code that had been written 4 years earlier, but was basically ignored. In fact, he didn't just enforce it, he added to it. It was like he had his own Bill of Rights and Constitution of things you can't do in the movies. So many little moments in this movie that are charming, believe it or not, would have been taken out because of Breen and the censorship office. Excellent question. And yes, there's so many movies. I'm just so glad they came out in June of 1934. We got them just in time. Yes, right over here, Lowell.
I had heard the story that Capra had got involved with this film, wrote the film, when he was at La Quinta Resort. And if I heard it correctly, he considered the resort very lucky for him. It had good vibes for him, and that he did some additional writing while he was there or in the future. Do you know anything about that?
I do, and I will say that Frank Capra was a superb director of romantic comedies and dramas in the 1930s. He did not write the films, though. Robert Riskin wrote this film, and he worked with Capra at the La Quinta. Yes, exactly. And they, in fact, did that on Lost Horizon. They did that on other films. He loved the idea of getting away, and in fact, he passed away here, Frank Capra. So La Quinta was obviously a very special place for him. It's also a place I learned researching my book on the composer Max Steiner, that Max loved to take all the money he was making at RKO scoring movies like King Kong and then gamble it away in La Quinta. So he left a part of himself here as well. But yes, Lowell, you're absolutely right that Robert Riskin and Capra like to get away from, for one thing, I'm sure they like to get away from Harry Cohn, the very obstreperous head of Columbia Pictures. Great story about, this has been told about Harry Cohn and about Jack Warner. It maybe never happened, but it's too good a story not to tell. Let's say it was Harry Cohn. He was walking past the writers' building on the lot, and it was all silent, and he expected all of his writers to be in there working, and he yelled up there, "Why isn't anybody writing?" And then you started to hear the clicking of typewriters, and he said, "Liars!" So, thank you, Lowell. Yes, any other thoughts or questions? Or oh, yes, up here in the front, yes.
That was a wonderful introduction, and it makes me sad that the dialogue is in today's movies just doesn't compare.
I know, saying that the dialogue today doesn't compare. Well, it's interesting in that this is one of those movies that is still viewed by screenwriters, it's admired by them, it's still taught as a model screenplay. I think that Riskin does a wonderful job balancing the two characters. You have sympathy for Claudette Colbert's character, and you certainly like Gable, and the father, Walter Connolly, is so charming. So as to why more movies aren't like this, I think it's because we don't have obstacles in our society anymore, you know? And in the older days, well, you didn't have cell phones, obviously, but there were cultural and class icons that culture and class obstacles, I mean, that separate people. So there were more ways to keep people apart in those days. It's sort of like Romeo and Juliet, you know, if there had been cell phones, she could have very quickly found out that he didn't die of the plague. So, but there are various ways to overcome that even in these days. But I agree with you. I wish there were more movies that had the wit and charm and characterization of this film.
I wanted to build on the T-shirt controversy. Some of us hair starts to grow everywhere, and I noticed how much hair Clark had on his legs and how much hair he has on his head and eyebrows. It looked like maybe they shaved him before they took his shirt off.
No comment. I will just say, go to the internet, but don't trust what you see. Well, maybe on that note, I'd just like to say thank you to Christine and Abe for sponsoring the series. Thank you to TJ, Aaron, and Stephen of the library. And thanks to all of you for making this a success. Have a wonderful holiday, and please come back, well, for many things in between, but I will be back in February for a 3-week series on censorship and the movies that were made before Hollywood was enforcing its censorship. They are all very entertaining, and so I hope you will join me for those. Wonderful holiday, Happy New Year, and thank you again for coming today.